Right now, without anyone approving it, a phone is paying rent. Every time it slips from one tower to the next, walking to the kitchen, riding a train, mid-sentence on a call, a meter runs. In 2024, Americans ran that meter across 132 trillion megabytes of mobile data, 32 trillion more than the year before, the largest single-year jump on record. Over 579 million connections, roughly 1 7/10 for every person in the country. Nobody was ever asked to approve any of it. It happens all day long, and on the other end of it, someone is getting paid. So you decide you want to be that someone. You want the company on the other end of that invisible transaction, the one that gets paid whether the customer stares at the phone or leaves it face down on the table. Here is what you would actually be buying. And here is the one sentence in the deal that means you never quite own it. The fantasy is clean, which is why it sells. A customer signs up once, pays every month, forgets the money is even leaving the account, and stays for the better part of a decade. Only 3 companies in the country are allowed to run that machine at national scale. In 2024, Verizon booked $134.8 billion of revenue, AT&T $122.3 billion, and T-Mobile $81.4 billion. And between them, they hold essentially the entire market. There are more active connections in America than there are Americans. The market is full, and nobody new is coming in. What's for sale is a seat at a table that seats exactly 3, and the machinery is stranger than the fantasy. You can't actually buy the thing you're picturing, because owning a carrier splits into 2 very different purchases at very different prices. You can own the network itself, the spectrum and the physical grid of towers and switching gear, which runs into the tens of billions and is effectively closed to newcomers. Or you can own a brand that rents someone else's network, a mobile virtual operator, which you could start this afternoon for about $50,000. Same industry, 2 purchases that share almost nothing. And here is where the fantasy takes its first real hit. Even if you buy the network, you don't own the towers. The carriers sold them. T-Mobile handed roughly 7,200 of its towers to Crown Castle in 2012 for $2.4 billion. AT&T sold about 9,700 to Crown Castle in 2013 for $4.85 billion. Verizon leased out around 11,300 to American Tower in 2015 for $5 billion. They took the cash, and now they pay rent on their own former towers, forever. The one part of this business that behaves like passive real estate, the kind of structure that quietly collects a check and drifts up in value, is precisely the part they handed to somebody else. What does a carrier actually own, then? Mostly something you can't see or touch. Verizon carries about $154 billion of wireless licenses on its balance sheet, roughly 41% of everything the company owns. It's the single most valuable asset in the building, and it's invisible, the legal right to use certain radio frequencies. The licenses run 10 years at a time, which sounds like a lease that could lapse. In practice, renewal is routine, so the accountants treat spectrum as an asset with no expiry and never depreciate it. The cash went out the door once, at auction, and the cost never runs through the profit line again unless the license is written down. That auction is the real gate, because spectrum is the license to exist. In the FCC's C-band auction, whose winners were announced in February 2021, the bidding ran to $81.17 billion for a strip of mid-band airwaves, the most expensive mid-band 5G auction ever held. The 3 national carriers took the lion's share. Verizon alone wrote a check for $45.45 billion, AT&T for $23.41, T-Mobile for $9.34, and those were only the winning bids. Add the payments to move the satellite companies already sitting in that band, another $13 to $14 billion, and the program ran toward $94 billion all in. Then you still have to build the thing. A single macro cell site, the tower kit and the radios on it, runs somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000. Verizon operates more than 70,000 sites, AT&T around 65,000. 65,000 sites at $250,000 each is roughly $16 billion of steel and electronics, and that is a rough figure drawn on air, before spectrum, before a single customer connects. The cheap path looks like a bargain by comparison. A branded reseller runs $10,000 to $50,000, a light operator $100,000 to $400,000, a full-scale virtual carrier $2 to $10 million or more. But the low tiers buy you a storefront, and the carrier underneath stays someone else's. You set the logo and the price on the box, and you control none of the economics inside it. And once you own it, the network costs money every year just to stay in place. The 3 big carriers spent roughly $46 billion of reported capital in 2024, a figure that folds in their wired networks too. Count the wireless side alone, and it's nearer 30 billion, depending on who's counting. Either way, they'll spend something like 20 billion a year, every year, forever, just to keep the network from getting slower. The tower rent they now owe runs somewhere between $1,900 and $3,500 per site per month, and it rises about 3% a year by contract, automatically, whether or not a single new customer signs up. Before any of that, a slice comes off the top as a federal surcharge on phone revenue, which hit a record 38.1% of the assessed base by late 2025. Now set that against demand. Traffic on these networks climbs more than 30% a year. The average bill rises about 3. Customers pour more through the pipe every year and pay only slightly more for it, so the carrier has to keep spending to carry traffic it barely gets paid extra to move. This is why the folklore that 5G prints money is exactly backwards. 5G cost $81 billion in spectrum, 13 to 14 billion more to clear the band, and tens of billions again to deploy. It isn't a printing press. It's a treadmill that bills you to keep running. So where does the money actually come from, if not the phone, and not even the call? The handset barely earns anything, and the network is a cost center. The money is the recurring bill, at a margin that would embarrass most industries. Strip out the near break-even phone sales, and T-Mobile's service business ran about $66.2 billion in 2024, up 5%, with $31.8 billion in core earnings, before interest, taxes, and depreciation sitting on top of it. Measured against that service revenue, the margin is around 48%. Close to half of every service dollar is profit. The number that governs all of it is one most people have never heard: churn, the share of customers who walk away each month. T-Mobile's ran 0.86% in 2024, the best in its history. Verizon's was around 0.89 in the fourth quarter, and AT&T's near 0.85 on postpaid phones, though that one moves around depending on exactly what's counted. Those numbers are small for a reason. If a customer has less than a 1% chance of leaving in any given month, the average customer stays somewhere around 8 to 10 years. That's an implied figure, not one the companies report, but call it roughly a decade of a bill that renews itself. Across 100 million subscribers, a single tenth of a point of churn is worth hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They grow that bill by laddering it up, a few dollars at a time, a premium unlimited tier here, a $10 hotspot line there, a streaming bundle folded in. Each add-on is small relative to the base bill and drops almost straight to margin, incremental revenue per user at near zero marginal cost. Unlimited removes the metering friction that would otherwise cap usage, so average consumption per line keeps climbing while the price stays flat. The measure here trips people up constantly. A single T-Mobile account averaged about $152 a month in 2024, but an account often carries several lines. Per line, the figure is closer to $48. Two different numbers for two different things, and people mix them up all the time. The subsidy folklore is worth correcting too. As the carrier, you no longer subsidize the phone. That ended around 2013. The customer now pays full retail for the handset, spread over 24 to 36 months, interest-free on an installment plan, and you are the lender. T-Mobile carried about $3.6 billion of those phone loans on its books as of September 2024, and it bundles and sells them the way a bank sells its loans, a meaningful slice of them to customers a bank would call subprime. The handset is a loan on your books, collected back through the monthly bill, and the newest growth line barely costs them anything because it reuses spectrum they already paid for. Verizon ended 2024 with about 4.6 million home internet customers running over its wireless network, part of 12.3 million broadband connections, up 15% on the year, the same paid-for airwaves earning a second time. None of this is theory, and the cleanest way to see the structure is to watch what happened to the companies that got it wrong and the one that got it right. Start with Sprint. Its collapse gets blamed on bad management, but the machinery that actually killed it was arithmetic. Sprint stapled together two networks that could never truly merge, its own and Nextel's proprietary IDEN system, and spent years unable to run them as one. In February 2008, it wrote off $29.7 billion of goodwill, erasing nearly the whole value of the Nextel it had bought for around $35 billion 3 years earlier. It shut the IDEN network off for good in June 2013, and it never reached the scale the business demands. Carrying around $34 billion of debt, it couldn't fund the capital its network needed, and by one analyst's read, it was already headed for bankruptcy. Nothing beat Sprint but its own size. It was simply too small for a business that only pays off at scale. The company that ate it is the same story from the other side. T-Mobile's turnaround was seeded by a rival's failure. When AT&T's $39 billion attempt to buy it collapsed in 2011, AT&T had to pay a breakup package of $3 billion in cash, plus a slug of spectrum and roaming rights. That windfall funded the network that the Un-carrier marketing then made famous. T-Mobile killed the 2-year contract in 2013, added 3.7 million customers over the next 9 months, and grew from about 30 million subscribers to roughly 100 million by 2020. Then it bought Sprint for about $26 billion in stock, closing in April 2020 and taking the country from 4 national carriers to 3. This time the networks fit. Sprint's mid-band spectrum was exactly what T-Mobile lacked, so combining them lowered the cost of carrying each bit instead of stranding it. The same move as Sprint and Nextel, and the opposite result, entirely because the spectrum was complementary rather than incompatible. And then there's the case that settles the argument. The government actually tried to build a 4th national carrier on purpose. As a condition of clearing the T-Mobile and Sprint merger, it handed a new entrant, Dish, about 9.3 million existing prepaid customers and cheap spectrum for something like $5 billion, and told it to go build. Dish had subscribers on day 1 and a regulator willing it to succeed. The structure crushed it anyway. Its base bled down towards 7 million. It booked billions in write-downs. It took on well over $20 billion of debt, and its auditors flagged doubt about whether it could keep going. As of early July 2026, America's would-be 4th network exists mostly as line items on its rivals' balance sheets. It agreed to sell spectrum to AT&T for around $23 billion, and to SpaceX for around $17, roughly $42 billion in all. Agreed to run its remaining service over AT&T's network, and its Dish satellite and wireless units filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on June 30, 2026. When a 4th carrier is handed customers and spectrum and still fails, what defeated it was the shape of the business itself. Price a single carrier 2 ways, a good year and a bad one, using a mid-size operator with 4 million customers as the model. These next figures are illustrative, built from the industry's real margins rather than any one company's statement. In a good year, 4 million subscribers at about $50 a month is $2.4 billion of service revenue. At a 40% operating margin, that's about $960 million in operating profit. Take out network spending at roughly 15% of revenue, about $360 million. Take out the fixed spectrum and tower costs, about $200 million. Take out interest on the debt, about $150 million. You're left with roughly $250 million of cash profit, on a base of customers who each stay 7 or 8 years at a 1% monthly churn. And on that base, the cash simply pours out. Now let a price war break out, which is routine, and change nothing structural. Churn doubles from 1% a month to 2%. The average bill slips from $50 to $45 under promotional pressure. Revenue falls to about $2.05 billion. The margin compresses from 40% to 30%, so operating profit drops to about $620 million. But the network spending does not fall. Skip it and the network degrades, and you lose even more customers, so it holds at $360 million. The spectrum, the towers, and the interest are fixed by contract and don't move, another $350 million. Now you're about $90 million in the red. A 10% dip in the average bill and a doubling of churn, both ordinary in a price fight, are enough to flip the whole company from gushing cash to losing money, because the biggest costs are fixed. Network spending can't be cut without bleeding customers, and the spectrum, the towers, and the debt are locked in by contract, paid in a bad year exactly as in a good one. That same fixed cost trap rewarded a T-Mobile with scale and buried a Sprint without it, along with a Dish that was handed everything and still went under. So walk back to the meter you wanted to own. For a buyer with means, the realistic win sits well short of owning Verizon. That seat is taken, and the price of the chair is measured in tens of billions. The realistic win is smaller and sideways. Build a brand on someone else's network, gather a few million customers, and sell them to the carrier whose network you were renting. It has happened more than once. TracFone sold to Verizon for up to $6.9 billion in 2021. Mint Mobile sold to T-Mobile for up to $1.35 billion in 2023. The very thing that makes a small carrier work, that your host controls your economics, is the same thing that makes it dangerous, because your host is also the only real buyer you'll ever have. Others found the far end of that bargain. Amped Mobile, a virtual carrier riding Verizon's network, burned through nearly $400 million and went dark in 2007, still owing Verizon millions. What you'd be buying then is a government-gated annuity that only wears the shape of a phone company, a machine with a brutal maintenance bill, one where you'd already sold off the only genuinely passive part, and where the entire difference between a fortune and a loss hinges on a number almost no customer has ever heard, under 0.9%. That is the meter you wanted to own. It was never really counting megabytes, it was counting the months your customers stay. Now you can read it.